A single gunshot tore through the blizzard. Then silence, the kind that only comes after something terrible has already happened. High on a Montana mountainside, snow doesn't fall. It arrives. Heavy. Certain. The way a verdict arrives, decided long before anyone opens their mouth. A woman pushes through snow drifted knee-deep. Her frozen hands grip a rifle. Her belly heavy, her breath fogging white in the dark, but her legs refuse to stop moving. Ahead, firelight trembles through a gap in the boards of an abandoned line shack. A man laughs somewhere inside. Blood stains the white snow dark. All her life, they told her she was too much. Too big. Too heavy for anyone to want to carry. Tonight, too much is the only thing that can save the man tied up inside. She raises the rifle. Draws one slow breath. And steps out of the shadows. Snow doesn't fall in Larkspur Hollow. It arrives. Heavy. Certain. The way judgment arrives, dressed up quiet and patient, waiting for the room to go still, before it does its worst. On the morning Leah Zuck stood before the council, the sky over Montana territory had already decided everything. Long before the elders opened their mouths. She knew that room by heart. Whitewashed walls. Plain benches worn smooth by decades of prayer. A clock on the far wall that ticked too loud. Like it wanted everyone present to know exactly how fast time was running out. She had swept this floor 1,000 times, as a girl. Knees on the boards. Rag in her hand. Humming hymns nobody asked her to hum. Now she stood in the middle of it like a stranger. On trial. In her own church. 5 men sat facing her. 5 faces she had known her whole life. Not one of them would hold her eyes for longer than a breath. Which told her everything, before a single word was spoken. Bishop Weaver cleared his throat first. He always did. A habit. Or maybe a warning shot, fired before the real words came marching in behind it. Sister Leah. His voice came out gentle. That was the worst part of it. Gentle, like he believed he was doing her some kindness. We have prayed on this. Many months now. Leah folded her hands over her apron. Kept them still. Because if she let them shake, everyone in that room would see. And seeing was the one thing she couldn't afford to give them today. You are 28. The bishop said it like she might not know her own age. As if the years hadn't already been counted for her. Whispered behind hands. Tallied up like debts owed and never paid. Unmarried. Silence. Waiting for her to fill it. She didn't. Elder Amos Bontrager leaned forward. Nobody had asked him to speak. He spoke anyway. He always did. The community can't carry the burden forever, Bishop. His eyes flicked toward her waist. Her shoulders. The parts of her that had never once fit the mold this settlement kept trying to press her into. She eats enough for 2 women. Works hard enough, I'll grant her that much. But no man will have her. And a woman, who can't be given in marriage is simply a mouth the rest of us feed for nothing. A mouth. That's what she was now. Reduced to that one word, sitting flat and final in the center of the room. Leah felt it land somewhere behind her ribs. And stay there. Like a stone dropped down a well too deep to hear it hit bottom. Within the month, Bishop Weaver went on, not quite looking at Amos, not quite disagreeing with him either. We will see you placed at the mission house in Helena. Among the English. Perhaps you'll find. Find what? Leah's voice came out too sharp. She heard it land wrong in the quiet room. Didn't take it back. The bishop's jaw tightened. Work more suited to your circumstances. Her circumstances. Her body. Say it plain, she thought. Just once. Somebody in this room, say it plain instead of dressing it up in scripture, and soft, sorry voices. Nobody did. She looked past the bishop. Past Amos. Toward the small window, where snow had already begun collecting along the sill. Her parents were buried behind that very church. Her mother's bread recipe existed only in Leah's own handwriting, because her mother had never learned her letters well enough to write it down herself. Her father used to sing off-key during hymns, and laugh about it after, unbothered, unashamed. This ground. This whole soaked, frozen, familiar ground. It was the only home she had ever stood on. Where would I go? Not really a question. More like something breaking loose inside her, and drifting out, before she could stop it. I have no kin in Helena. No trade the English would want, from a woman like me. This is my home. The Lord provides, the bishop said. Men always said that right before they turned their backs on someone. She had learned that much today, if nothing else. Go in peace, sister. Which was not peace at all. Which was a door closing, dressed up in church language, so nobody in the room would have to hear it slam. She walked out, into air so cold it felt solid against her skin. The sky pressed low, and gray over the bare field stretching out beyond the meeting house. A few children stood watching, from doorways, the way you'd watch weather turning bad. Somewhere behind a curtain, a woman's face appeared. Then vanished. Leah pulled her shawl tight and walked. Didn't know where. Only knew she had to keep her legs moving, or she would fall right there in the frozen yard, and never manage to get back up. She reached the tree line at the edge of the settlement, where the fields gave way to pine, and stopped. Because her body simply refused to carry her one step farther. She sagged hard against a fence post. The wind cut straight through her wool dress like it held some personal grievance against her specifically. Within the month, they'd said. Within the month to find a husband, in a community, where every eligible man had already spent a decade deciding she was too much of everything, and not quite enough of anything worth keeping. They're fools. The voice came low, and sudden from the shadow beneath the pines. Leah's heart slammed once, hard, before her mind even caught up to what her ears had already heard. A man stepped out from beneath the trees. Tall. Taller than any man she had ever stood close to in her life. Shoulders built like a barn door, wrapped in buckskin, and fur gone dark, with melting snow. Dark hair shot through with early gray. A beard that looked wild at first glance, but had clearly been combed, with some care. And eyes. Steady eyes. The kind that didn't flinch away, from whatever they happened to be looking at. Which, right now, was her. Not just her waist. Not just the shape the elders had spent all morning discussing like she was livestock up for appraisal. Her. All of her. Who are you? She managed. Caleb Ashford. A slight tip of his head. Trade with your people some seasons. Was passing the meeting house window on my way through. Heard what they told you in there. His mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Something closer to disgust, aimed somewhere over her shoulder, back toward the church behind her. Sending you off, he said, because you take up too much room at their table. Fools. Every last one of them, standing in judgment, over a woman worth more than the whole lot combined. I should not be speaking with you. The rule came automatic. Some deep groove worn into her by 28 years of teaching, even as the rest of her world was actively falling apart around her boots. You are English. I'm a mountain man. He said it plain. No apology folded into it anywhere. And I'm a man who knows a fine thing, when it's standing right in front of him. His eyes didn't move off her face. Not once. You need a husband, he said. I need a wife. One who can work. one who won't break the first hard winter this mountain throws at her. Leah's breath went thin in her chest. Because nobody had ever spoken to her like this. Not once. Not in 28 years of living in a body the whole settlement had already decided how to measure. "Marry me, Leah Zuck." He said her name like he had already decided, somewhere deep and certain, that it belonged to him now. "Come up the mountain with me. By spring, you'll give me 3 sons." The wind went still. Or maybe it was her. Maybe her whole body simply stopped, right there against that fence post, waiting to see if the world was about to laugh at her. It didn't laugh. It only kept snowing, quiet and patient, like it already knew precisely how this particular story was going to end. Which was, of course, impossible. Nobody knows how a story ends. Except sometimes, standing at the very edge of your old life, with nothing left to lose, you make a choice, so wild it feels less like a decision, and more like a door swinging open on its own. She thought about the mission house in Helena. Thought about strange English faces, and streets she'd never walked, and a trade she had no earthly notion how to learn at 28 years old, friendless, alone. Then she thought about this man's eyes. How they hadn't once flicked down to her body the way every other man's did. How he'd said too much room at their table like it was a crime committed by the table. Not by her. "I don't know you," she whispered. "No," Caleb agreed. "But you know exactly what waits for you, if you don't come." Which was true. Which was the plainest, cruelest, most useful truth anybody had spoken to her all day. "Give me until morning," she said. He nodded once. Turned back toward the trees. Then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, not looking back at her, "you're not too much of anything, Leah Zuck. You're exactly enough. Just for the wrong men, up to now." Then he was gone. Swallowed whole by the pines, leaving her alone at the fence post, with her heart hammering, and the snow falling soft and endless all around her, and a decision sitting in her chest like a live coal she couldn't set down. She walked back to the small house, that was already, by law and custom, no longer entirely hers. Sat by the cold hearth long, into the night. Thought about her mother's hands. Her father's off-key hymns. The graves behind the church, that would still be there whether or not she stayed close to them. By morning, she had her answer. Morning came the color of old iron. Leah stood outside the house, that no longer belonged to her, looking out at fields she had plowed, with her own 2 hands, since she was a girl too small to see, over the plow handles. Every stone in that yard carried a memory nailed into it somewhere. None of those memories would be going with her now. Caleb arrived at first light. A massive roan stallion beneath him, a pack mule trailing on a lead rope behind. His coat dusted white from the ride up. The whole settlement seemed to hold its breath, as he came, through the gate. Because a man like that didn't belong in a place built on plain wagons and quiet obedience. He belonged somewhere the wind actually meant something. Somewhere a person had to earn their footing every single day. "You ready?" he asked her. She wasn't. Not even a little. She nodded anyway. Bishop Weaver stepped from the meeting house, Bible held against his chest like a shield he suddenly needed. His face was doing 2 things at once. Relief, plain and simple, that the problem was solving itself. And something close to shame, underneath, that it had come to be solved this particular way. "Brother Ashford." The bishop's voice came out stiff. "You understand the seriousness. Taking an Amish woman as wife. I understand marriage plenty." Caleb's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. "And I understand this woman's worth. Which is a good deal more than I can say for the men who sat in judgment over her yesterday." The bishop's mouth thinned to a hard line. He said nothing back. Opened the Bible instead and began. It was short. Amish weddings usually stretched on for hours. Full hymns. Long silences. Sermons that circled back on themselves twice, before finding their landing. This one took 5 minutes. Maybe less. Nobody standing in that yard wanted a spectacle today. Least of all Leah. Her hands were sweating inside her mittens despite the cold. Her breath came out in short white clouds. Her best dress, the blue wool one, the only garment that had ever fit her the way she actually wanted it to, strained slightly at the shoulders. And she felt every inch of herself on display, like an accusation the whole yard had gathered to witness one final time. Caleb stood beside her calm as carved stone. "You may seal the covenant," the bishop said. Caleb didn't hesitate. He tipped her chin up, with 2 fingers, and kissed her. It wasn't the fumbling, apologetic thing she had once imagined some nervous farm boy might someday offer her, back when she still let herself imagine such things at all. It was warm. Steady. His hand at her jaw like he was holding something he fully intended to keep for the rest of his life. "That's one of many to come, wife," he murmured against her ear. And her face went hot enough to fight the cold clean off her cheeks. The witnesses signed. 2 elders. And Sister Ruth, who gave Leah a smile that trembled hard at the edges. Then it was done. Leah Zuck was Leah Ashford now. Before they left, Sister Ruth pressed a small linen parcel into her hands. For the wedding night, the older woman whispered. "Herbs. For easing things along." Her eyes went soft and wet at the corners. "I'm sorry, child. You deserved a great deal better than what this place gave you." It was the closest thing to an apology Leah would ever receive, from anyone in that settlement. She held onto it the way you hold onto the last warm coal left in a dying fire. Climbing into the wagon, she felt every eye in the yard land on her at once. Women who had never once looked at her straight now stared openly. Some turned away, as though she carried something contagious. One older woman crossed herself, as if Leah were walking straight into sin instead of simply walking away from a place that had never wanted her. Only one person stepped forward. Josiah, the stonemason's boy, who had teased her something cruel back when they were both children, and now stood there looking like he wished he could take every last word of it back. "Goodbye, Leah. Quiet. May the Lord go with you." "And also with you," she managed. Caleb flicked the reins. The wagon jerked forward. She didn't look back. Not until they rounded the bend, and the settlement was already shrinking behind them, swallowed inch by inch, into the white horizon. Her church. Her parents' graves. Her whole life, folding itself small enough to disappear entirely from view. They rode in silence the first hour. Leah gripped the wagon seat, so hard her knuckles ached. "You're free of them now," Caleb said finally. Not unkind. Just stating a fact, the way he might mention weather rolling in. "I wasn't trying to be free." Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "I was only ever trying to fit." He made a sound low in his chest. Not quite a laugh. "A woman like you doesn't fit in boxes built by small men. That settlement never once deserved to keep you." She flinched at that. Because nobody had ever spoken about her like she was something worth keeping. Instead of something to be managed. Contained. Quietly disposed of when it became inconvenient enough. "You're quiet," he said. "I've never left home before." "You're not leaving home." He didn't look at her when he said it. Kept his eyes on the road, on the pines pressing tighter and tighter around them, like the walls of a church built entirely out of trees. "You're going toward it." The snow deepened as the road narrowed. Wind fell away behind the trees, replaced by the creak of leather, and the soft crunch of hooves sinking into fresh drifts. Caleb handled the horses like a man who had never once been afraid of this particular country. Because the mountain didn't frighten him. If anything, the mountain answered to him. Why me, Caleb? Her breath fogged out in front of her face. Not the thing you said back at the fence post. I mean truly. Why? He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice had gone rough at the edges. Honest in a way that made her chest ache in a manner she didn't yet have words for. Because I've lived alone long enough to know exactly what matters. He glanced sideways at her, just once. Don't need delicate. Don't need small. Need strong. Steady. A woman who won't give up in the first bad storm this mountain sends her way. A pause. A woman built for winter. Something warm moved through her chest at that. She didn't have a name for it yet. 28 years of being told she was too much of everything, and this man said it like it was a blessing handed down. Not a flaw to be corrected. By sundown they had climbed high, into the foothills. Caleb pointed ahead through the trees. Another hour, he said. Then the cabin. Supper. A fire. His voice thickened just slightly. And then our marriage proper, if you're willing. Her pulse jumped hard enough that she felt it in her throat. Tonight. Her first time. Her wedding night, arriving real and close now, no longer some abstract thing to dread, from a comfortable distance. I'll try to be brave, she whispered. You already are, he said. And she believed him. Didn't know why exactly. Just did. The cabin came up, through the trees like something the mountain itself had grown out of the ground. Thick timbers. A stone chimney breathing pale smoke, into the darkening sky. Warm light glowing behind thick window panes. Leah had never in her life seen a home look so solid. So entirely alive. Caleb halted the horses, and climbed down first, offering his hand up to her. Snow drifted around them, soft as breath. Welcome home, Leah. Home. The word hit her harder than she expected. Landed somewhere she hadn't thought to brace against it. She let him help her down. The ground was uneven, her weight making her unsteady, after so many hours cramped in the wagon, but Caleb lifted her like she weighed nothing at all. Like a well-packed sack of flour. It startled her clean through. No man in her old life had ever touched her, unless he had no other choice available. And even then, always quick. Careful. Like touching something breakable in the exact wrong direction. Caleb didn't touch her like that. He touched her like she was solid ground herself. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, and pine sap, and something rich simmering low, over the fire. A broad hearth. A sturdy table, scarred from years of use. Shelves crowded with jars and tools. Furs layered thick over the floorboards. Sit, Caleb said, nodding toward the chair nearest the fire. She sat. Her heart still going too fast. He hung his coat. Stirred the pot. Ladled stew into a bowl, and set it in front of her, steam curling up, into the lamplight. I can serve myself, she said. Old habit. Old rule, worn deep. I know you can. He said it simple. But you're my wife now. First night in my home, you eat first. No man had ever told her that in her whole life. In her old life, the men ate first, always, and she, being large, being watched, being weighed by every eye in every room she ever entered, had learned young to take less. So nobody would think her greedy. She ate slowly. Warmth spreading through her from the inside out. And not only from the stew. Caleb ate after, in long unhurried bites, his gaze flicking to her now and then. Not measuring. Not judging. Simply watching her exist, like it was something genuinely worth watching. When the bowls were cleared, and the fire banked low, the cabin went too quiet. Too full of everything that hadn't been said, yet between them. Leah's hand started to shake. Caleb noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything, this man. "You're afraid," he said. Not an accusation. Just the truth, laid flat on the table between them like something honest finally being set down. She stared into the fire. "I don't know what's expected of me. What a man wants from a wife. I've never, nobody's ever." She couldn't finish it. Didn't need to. Caleb moved slow. Deliberate. Knelt down in front of her chair, and she nearly gasped at the sight of it. This enormous man folding himself down low, like something closer to reverence than anything else she'd ever witnessed. "Look at me," he said. She lifted her eyes. "I don't expect a performance," he told her. "Don't expect perfection either. I expect honesty. Give me that. I'll give you everything else this life has to offer." Her throat went tight. "This body," he said, low, steady, "is your body. The one that'll carry you through hard winters. The one that'll bear my children, if the Lord's willing to allow it. There's nothing about it I fear. Nothing about it I don't want." He rose and held out his hand. "Come upstairs with me. If you want to stop, we stop. If you're unsure of anything, we wait." His voice roughened at the edges. "This marriage will never be a weight on you, Leah. Not once. Not ever, so long as I'm breathing." Her breath shook loose, from somewhere deep in her chest. "I'll come," she whispered. The loft stairs creaked beneath them. Her heart pounded, so loud she thought the whole cabin must hear it too, echoing back off the timbers. At the top, lantern light fell soft, and gold across a bed piled high with furs. She froze at the sight of it. Caleb turned to her. Didn't press closer. Held his hands open at his sides, waiting. "Let me help you feel safe," he said quietly. She nodded. He touched her cheek first. Barely more than a breath of contact. Then her jaw. Then the back of her neck. Warmth bloomed everywhere his fingers passed, over her skin. "Tell me if something frightens you," he murmured. "I will," she whispered back. What happened after, that belonged only to the two of them. And to the fire burning low below the loft. And to the storm outside, that had gone strangely gentle for one single night, as though even the mountain itself understood this moment deserved some measure of quiet. When it was over, Leah lay curled against his chest, listening to her own heartbeat slow, until it finally matched his. "Caleb," she whispered. "Yes, wife. That thing you said. About 3 sons by spring." She hesitated. "Do you truly believe it? Or was it only a thing men say to frighten girls, into marrying them quick?" A long pause. Long enough that she wondered, if he'd drifted off to sleep already. "I don't believe it," he said finally, his voice rough in the dark. "I know it." There was something underneath those words. Something old and heavy she couldn't, yet see the full shape of. She was too tired, too full of everything, that had happened in a single impossible day, to chase it any further tonight. Her last thought, before sleep finally took her was simple, and strange, and entirely unlike anything she'd ever let herself think before. If this is madness, she thought, let it be mine. The first weeks on the mountain moved to a rhythm Leah had never known existed anywhere before. Hard work. Yes, plenty of it. But a different kind entirely. Work that fed something inside her instead of only wearing her down to nothing. No whispered judgments here. No stairs following her across a yard. No quiet, constant pressure to shrink herself smaller, and smaller until there was nothing left worth anyone's comment. Each morning the sun came up late, and pale over the surrounding peaks. Leah woke in the loft, with Caleb's arm heavy across her waist. His breathing slow and steady beside her. He always woke first. Always stayed still, until she stirred on her own, and she caught him one particular morning, with the smallest smile resting on his face. Like waking up next to her was its own private miracle he hadn't quite gotten used to yet. She stoked the fire, while he split wood outside. She baked loaves dense enough to last the whole week through. He tanned hides, mended tools, checked the trap lines, that fed them both, through the coldest stretches. In the evenings they sat together by the fire. Leah sewing, or reading from her battered German Bible. Caleb carving small things. Spoons, mostly. Cup handles. Then, one particular night, a cradle. Simple. Sturdy. Beautiful in exactly how plain it was. "You're making that awfully early," Leah said, trying to smile, though her chest had gone tight. "Spring comes sooner than you'd think up here," he said. And there was that certainty in his voice again, the one that unsettled her more than she ever let on out loud. Because she refused to hope too wildly. Hope, in her experience, was a thing that broke a person clean in half, when it failed to come true. Except small things kept shifting anyway. Whether she let herself hope for them or not. Tiredness first. Bone-deep, unreasonable tiredness that pulled her under some afternoons, and left her waking beneath a blanket she didn't remember Caleb ever placing over her. Then cravings, strange combinations she'd never once wanted, before in her life. Rabbit with honey stirred through it. Hot milk with pepper. Caleb never laughed at any of it. Just made whatever she asked for, silent and steady, like this was the most ordinary business in the world. And then, almost too quiet to notice at first, her monthly cycle simply didn't come. She ignored it for the better part of a week. Blamed the travel. Blamed the cold. Blamed anything at all, that wasn't the truth standing plain right in front of her. She found Caleb one morning sitting on a fallen log outside the cabin, staring down at the valley below, with a look on his face soft enough to break her heart clean open. "You feel it," he said. Not a question at all. "I don't know what I feel," she said. Which was a lie. And they both knew at the moment it left her mouth. "You're quickening." "No." The word came out sharper than she meant it to. "It's too soon, Caleb. Far too soon for such a thing. For ordinary women, maybe." He turned to look at her fully now, eyes lit with that same quiet certainty that had unsettled her since the very moment they first met at that fence post. "You are not an ordinary woman, Leah Ashford." His hand came to rest gently against her belly. Rounder now. Fuller than it had been even a month before. Not by much. Enough that she'd noticed in the small mirror she still refused to look into for too long at a stretch. She pushed his hand away, too fast, too frightened by the whole idea of it. "Stop saying such things aloud. What if you're wrong? What if I let myself believe it, and it comes to absolutely nothing?" Caleb's voice gentled. "Leah." A beat, weighted and careful. "When have I ever once given you cause to doubt me?" She couldn't answer that honestly. Because he hadn't. Not once, in all these weeks. He waited until she met his eyes again. "By spring, 3 sons," he said. "You don't need to understand the how of it. Only need to let it happen in its own time." She turned away from him, trembling, and stared out at the valley instead. Somewhere down there sat the settlement, that had thrown her away like she was nothing worth keeping. Up here, this man kept speaking about her body like it was carrying miracles instead of shame. She didn't yet know which version of herself she was supposed to believe in. Winter thickened through December, and into the raw, biting edge of January. Snow piled up higher than the windowsills. Storms rolled down off the peaks like great pale animals, breathing hard and heavy against the cabin walls, through the long nights. Leah and Caleb settled deeper, into the rhythm of pure survival, working in tandem, through the dark months. Caleb teaching her how to mend a snowshoe properly. Leah teaching him how to bake bread that wouldn't crack a man's teeth clean in half. Small things, woven together slowly, into something larger than either of them, yet had a proper name for. Her body kept changing faster than it reasonably should have. Breasts tender. Appetite doubled, then somehow doubled again on top of that. Her belly, undeniably rounder now, felt different beneath her own hands. Firmer. Fuller. Alive with something she still couldn't quite let herself believe in fully, even as the evidence mounted daily beneath her own palms. Caleb never gloated over any of it. Never once reminded her of what he'd promised back at that fence post in the snow. He simply tended to her, with a gentleness that deepened week over week, as though the transformation happening inside her was something holy he'd somehow been granted the rare privilege of witnessing up close. One night, as another storm clawed hard at the cabin walls outside, Leah felt something move low inside her. Faint. Impossible. Like the brush of a moth's wing against glass. She went very still. Caleb looked up, from the cradle he was still slowly, carefully finishing by lamplight. What is it? Something moved, she whispered, hand flying instinctively to her belly. He was beside her in an instant, kneeling in front of her chair, hands warm and steady against her. Are you frightened? He asked. I don't know. Tears sprang up fast, before she could stop them from coming. How can this be happening so quickly, Caleb? Because it was meant to. His voice had gone low, almost reverent in the firelight. Because you were meant to carry them, all along. She sobbed, quiet and shaking, and he pulled her into his arms, and held her like she was the single most precious thing standing on all of God's earth that night. You're not alone in this, he murmured, into her hair. I'm here. I will always be here, through whatever comes. For the first time, Leah didn't flinch away from the thought of it entirely. She let herself imagine it, just for one fragile moment. Small boys born into springtime, in a cabin warmed by fire, and something close enough to love now, that she'd finally stopped fighting the word itself. The flutter came again. This time she didn't cry. She smiled instead. It was on an ordinary afternoon, gray light pressing thin, through the window panes, that everything shifted again. Quietly. The way the worst discoveries always seem to arrive, sideways, when nobody's braced for them. Caleb had gone down to check the trap lines, before another storm rolled in off the peaks. Leah stayed behind to set the cabin in proper order, sweeping the floor, straightening shelves that had gone dusty in corners nobody bothered with day-to-day anymore. Which was how she found the trunk. Pushed back beneath the loft stairs, half hidden under a folded quilt she had never once seen him use in all these months together. She shouldn't have opened it. She knew that plainly, even as her hands were already lifting the lid. Inside, a small carved wooden cradle, far older and far more finely made than the one Caleb was building now downstairs by the hearth. Beside it, folded with a care that told her exactly how much it had once mattered to somebody, a woman's shawl, faded soft with age and handling. And tucked deep into the shawl's folds, a single carved wooden ring. Small. Delicate. Made specifically for a woman's finger. Carved along the base of that old cradle, worn nearly smooth, from years of handling, a name. Verity. Leah's breath caught somewhere high in her chest, and simply stayed there, refusing to move. She sat back on her heels, the trunk open, before her, snow ticking soft against the window glass, and for a long, suspended moment she didn't move at all. Didn't breathe right. Just stared at that name like it might somehow rearrange itself into something less frightening, if she looked at it long enough. It didn't. Because there had been someone before her. Someone this whole cabin had been built around once, long before Leah Zuck ever stood shivering at a fence post listening to a stranger promise her 3 sons out of the clear winter air. And Caleb had never once, in all these months, spoken that name aloud. Downstairs, the door opened. Boots stamped snow onto the floorboards below. Leah closed the trunk fast, hands shaking, and pushed it back beneath the stairs exactly the way she had found it. But some things, once seen, simply refuse to be put away again properly. No matter how carefully you try to hide them back, where they came from. She sat by the fire, when Caleb came up the loft stairs, hands folded tight in her lap, face arranged as calm as she could manage to make it. He looked at her for a long moment. Too long. Like he already sensed something had shifted in the room, without yet knowing precisely what. "You're pale," he said. "I'm only tired." The lie came easier than she expected it to. Which frightened her almost, as much as the trunk itself had. He studied her face a moment longer. Something moved behind his eyes. Worry, maybe. Or the particular stillness of a man standing guard over a door he didn't especially want open just yet. "Rest, then," he said finally, and turned back toward the fire. Leah watched the flames and said nothing further. But the question sat in her chest all the same. Heavy as the snow piling up against the windows outside, refusing entirely to melt away on its own. Who was Verity? And why, in all these weeks of tenderness, and truth freely given between them, had Caleb Ashford never once spoken her name? The name stayed with her for 3 full days. Verity. She didn't say it out loud, not once. Didn't need to. It lived behind her ribs now, right alongside the babies, right alongside everything else she was carrying, without ever having asked to carry it. Because that's precisely how secrets work inside a small house. They don't announce themselves at the door. They simply sit in the corner of every single room, waiting patiently for their moment. Caleb noticed the change in her. Of course he did. He noticed everything about her by now. The way she flinched slightly when he reached toward the trunk under the stairs for a spare blanket. The way her eyes slid away from his a half-second too fast to be entirely natural. He didn't ask. She didn't offer. Which left the two of them circling each other for 3 days like two animals who had both smelled something wrong on the wind, but couldn't yet name precisely what it was. On the 4th morning, he handed her a rifle. "Time you learned," he said. Leah looked at the weapon like it might bite her clean through. "I don't need to learn that." "You do." No argument at all in his voice. Just fact, laid down flat the way he laid down everything he believed. Winter up here doesn't care one bit what a woman needs. Only cares what she can actually do, when it counts. So she learned. He showed her how to brace the stock firm against her shoulder. How to breathe out slow, before pulling the trigger, not during, not after. The exact moment the lungs went fully empty. That was the moment to fire. She missed her first 6 shots badly, snow kicking up in places that had nothing whatsoever to do with the target nailed to the pine trunk 40 yards off. Again, Caleb said. Not unkind about it. Just patient in a way that made her want to cry, and she didn't fully understand why that was. By the 10th shot she clipped the edge of the board. By the 20th she put a hole dead center, and stood there staring at it like the mountain itself had shifted somehow underneath her boots. There, Caleb said. Something close to pride threading through his voice. Now you're dangerous. Leah lowered the rifle, breath fogging out in the cold air. I don't want to be dangerous. Too late. He almost smiled at that. Almost. You already were, long before today. This just gives it somewhere useful to go. She didn't quite know what to do with that thought. So she said nothing more, and reloaded instead, and something in her chest, some old, tired, folded up part of her, that had spent 28 years believing her body was only ever good for taking up too much space in a room, began, very slowly, to unfold itself for the first time. Except good mornings don't last forever. They never do. Not in a life shaped like this one. It was Josiah who brought the first warning, though nobody thought to call it that at the time it happened. He rode up from the settlement on a mule half dead, with exhaustion, 3 days after Leah's 20th shot had finally found its mark. Snow crusted thick on his coat. His face raw, and windburned from the long, hard cold. "Ashford," he called out, breathless, before he'd even fully swung down off the mule. "Mr. Ashford." Caleb was already at the door, rifle in hand out of pure habit alone. He lowered it the moment he saw the boy's face clearly. "Josiah. What's happened?" "Man came through the settlement 2 days back." Josiah's words tumbled out fast, tangled up with cold and worry both. "Said he worked for a company. Blackwood, I believe he called it. Blackwood Mining." Leah felt something drop low and cold in her stomach. Not the babies this time. Something else entirely. "Asking about what?" Caleb said. "Land." Josiah swallowed hard. "Your land, Mr. Ashford." Wanted to know who held the deed to the mountain parcel north of the settlement proper. Elder Bontrager talked with him a good long while. Longer than seemed right to me, watching it happen. Silence. The kind that carries real weight to it. The kind that presses down on a room, until somebody finally says something, anything, just to make the pressure stop. "Elder Bontrager," Caleb repeated. Flat. Careful. Like he was setting each individual word down on thin ice to test whether it would hold his full weight. "Yes, sir." Caleb's jaw worked once. Then twice. And Leah watched something pass behind his eyes, that she hadn't seen resting there before. Not fear exactly. Older than fear. Something closer to a debt finally, unavoidably coming due, after years of quiet waiting. "Thank you, Josiah," he said. "Get yourself warm. Eat something proper before you ride back down." The boy nodded, and led his exhausted mule toward the barn, and Caleb stood in the doorway a long moment afterward, staring out at the tree line like he half expected it to answer him back directly. "Caleb," Leah said quietly. "What is it? What's actually sitting on this land of ours?" He didn't turn around right away. "Silver," he said finally. "A vein of it, running under the ridge behind the cabin itself. Found it myself, years back now. Never told a single living soul." A pause, heavy with old caution. "Didn't think I needed to. A man doesn't go digging up trouble he doesn't strictly have to dig up on his own. And now somebody else has found it too." His voice had gone hard, flat, a door swinging firmly shut in real time. Or somebody told them precisely where to look for it. That night the wind screamed against the cabin walls like it held some kind of personal business with them specifically, and Leah lay awake long, after Caleb's breathing had gone slow, and even beside her in the dark. Except it wasn't truly even. Not really, not underneath. She could feel it, the tension still coiled tight, through his shoulders even deep in sleep, like a man standing quiet guard over something that hadn't arrived, yet but was surely already on its way. She thought about the trunk beneath the stairs. Thought about that carved name in old worn wood. Thought about silver hidden deep under a ridge, and a stranger asking careful questions in a settlement full of men, who had already decided, collectively, that she was worth less than nothing at all. Because everything felt connected now, suddenly, all at once. Every single secret in this house seemed to be circling down the very same drain, converging toward some point she couldn't yet see clearly. She didn't sleep that night. Just lay there listening to the storm outside, and waiting for morning to bring her some kind of answer at all. It brought her something else instead entirely. 3 full weeks passed by. The babies, she reminded herself firmly, though the sheer size of her belly by then had made the plural word feel less like fragile hope, and more like plain, undeniable fact, grew faster than any midwife's tale she had ever once heard whispered back home in her old life. She could feel movement now during most hours of the day. Small. Insistent. As if whatever lived inside her already understood it had somewhere important to be, and had no particular intention of waiting patiently around for spring to arrive at its own proper pace. Caleb finished the cradle at last. Set it down by the hearth, without a single word, the exact way a man sets down something far too heavy for ordinary speech to carry properly. And it was on an evening not long after that, the fire burned low, the wind gone quiet for once, snow falling soft and slow just outside the window glass, that Leah finally asked the question she'd been carrying for 3 long weeks like a stone tucked deep in her apron pocket. Who was Verity? Caleb went completely still. The knife in his hand, he'd been carving again, some small thing, a bird maybe, stopped moving entirely mid-stroke. Where'd you hear that particular name? The trunk. Under the stairs. No point at all in lying about it now. I wasn't looking for anything. I was only cleaning, and I found it, and I saw the cradle, and the shawl, and the ring, and she stopped herself short. Made herself breathe properly. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have opened it in the first place. Caleb set the knife down slow, careful, like it might go off somehow, if he moved too fast in that moment. No, he said. You had every right to. He was quiet a long while after that. Long enough that Leah began to think maybe he wasn't going to answer at all. That this was simply one door in this particular house, that would stay shut forever, no matter how many other doors he'd already opened wide for her. Then he started talking, and once he started, the words came pouring out like something dammed up far too long, finally given somewhere honest to go. Verity was my wife, he said. Before you. Before any of this life we've built together. He nodded toward the cabin around them, the mountain beyond it, the whole entire life he'd once built up here alone, and then rebuilt again since. We had this place together, the two of us. Built the cabin, with our own 4 hands, back before the war took me east for good. The war, Leah said softly. Fought 4 long years. His voice had gone rough now, distant, like he was speaking to her, from somewhere far behind his own eyes. Came home in 65. Thought I was coming home to a wife, and 2 young boys waiting for me. Leah's breath caught hard. Boys. Twins. He said the word like it cost him something real to spend it out loud. Born while I was still gone fighting. Verity wrote me letters full of them, first steps, first words, every small thing. I carried those letters folded in my coat pocket, through 3 entire winters of fighting. Read them so many times, over the paper wore soft, as cloth in my hands. He stopped there. Leah didn't push him further. Some silences simply need room enough to finish themselves properly, in their own time. Fever took the settlement, that last winter of the war, he said finally. Diphtheria, the doctor called it later, once one finally made it up the mountain, which turned out to be 2 full weeks too late to matter to anyone. Took 6 children in the valley below that winter. Took my sons. His jaw tightened hard. Took Verity 3 days, after that, nursing them right up, until the end, too worn down herself by then to fight it off any longer. Caleb. Leah's voice broke clean on his name. I came home to 3 graves, he said. Not a wife waiting. Not sons waiting. Graves. Standing right where that cradle sits today, I made myself a promise that winter. I promised Verity, standing right over her grave, that I'd have sons again someday. That I would not let this mountain stay empty of children forever, no matter what it cost me to fill it back up. He looked up at Leah then, and his eyes stood wet and unashamed in the firelight, though he didn't let a single tear actually fall. Told her I'd have 3 of them, if the Lord above ever allowed it. One for each of the 3 graves I couldn't fill back then. Leah sat frozen, through all of it, one hand pressed flat against her own belly, understanding finally landing on her all at once, heavy as a felled tree crashing down through brush. "That's the prophecy," she whispered. "That's what you meant, that day at the fence post. 3 sons by spring. Wasn't ever truly a prophecy," Caleb said quietly. "It was a promise. Made it 15 long years ago now, and never once believed I'd actually find a woman strong enough to help me finally keep it." He reached across the space between them, and took her hand, careful, like she might pull away from him even now. "Not until I saw you standing in that yard, being told plainly you were too much of everything a person could be. And I thought to myself, there stands a woman, who could hold the center of a house full of children, and never once break clean under the weight of carrying it." Leah's throat had gone far too tight to speak properly. So she didn't try. She only pressed his hand flatter against her belly, where something small turned over slow inside her, like it had somehow heard every single word just spoken between them. "I'm not her replacement." She managed it finally. Because that was the fear that had been sitting coiled in her chest for 3 straight weeks now, the one she hadn't let herself say plainly out loud, until this exact moment. "Tell me I'm not simply filling in graves you couldn't fill any other way." Caleb's hand tightened hard around hers. "No." Fierce. Sudden. More certain than she had ever once heard him say anything at all in these short months together. "You're not replacing a single thing, Leah. Verity was the woman I loved, as a much younger man, before this war made an entirely different man out of me for good. You're the woman I love now, as the man I've actually become since." His thumb traced slow circles over her knuckles. "Those are 2 entirely different men, loving 2 entirely different women. I won't insult either one of them by pretending they were ever the same love wearing 2 different faces." Something in her chest finally loosened, all at once. Some tight knot she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying, since the very moment she first opened that trunk beneath the stairs. "Then I'll help you keep your promise," she whispered. Not because it's some debt still owed to her memory. Because I want to, plainly, for myself. Because these 3 children are mine now too, every bit as much as they were ever meant to be yours. Caleb pulled her against his chest then, and for a long, while neither of them said another word out loud. The fire cracked low behind them. The snow kept falling, soft and endless, just outside the window glass. And somewhere inside that particular quiet, Leah understood clearly that this exact moment, this exact truth finally spoken plain between the 2 of them, was the real wedding vow all along. Everything that had come before it had only ever been rehearsal for this. Except peace never lasts terribly long in a life shaped quite like this one. It simply never does. 4 days later, a rider came up the mountain trail, who had nothing whatsoever to do with silver, or settlements, or old griefs finally laid properly to rest. This particular rider came with an entirely different kind of business altogether, and Leah felt it low in her stomach, before she ever once saw his face clearly. That particular cold, that has nothing at all to do with actual weather. Caleb was out checking the trap lines that morning. Leah stayed behind alone in the cabin, kneading bread dough at the table, when the dogs started up loud outside. Not the low, curious growl they typically gave for deer passing too close, through the trees. Something sharper entirely. Something that raised the hair straight up on the back of her own neck in pure sympathy. She wiped her hands clean, and went to the window. A man sat astride a dark horse at the edge of the clearing outside. Well-dressed for mountain country, too well-dressed if she was honest, a wool coat far too fine for weather like this, boots kept far too clean for the conditions. He studied the cabin a long moment, before finally calling out. "Anybody home?" Leah didn't answer at all. Didn't move an inch from behind the curtain. The man waited a while longer. Then, apparently satisfied that nobody intended to answer him, he did something that turned her blood straight to ice water in her veins. He dismounted slow. Walked directly toward the ridge behind the cabin, the exact ridge Caleb had once told her held the silver vein hidden beneath it, and crouched down there, running his gloved hand slowly along an exposed seam of rock like he was reading a private letter addressed specifically to him alone. He stayed roughly 10 minutes total. Long enough to make careful notes in a small leather book he kept tucked inside his coat pocket. Then he mounted back up, and rode off the exact way he'd come, without ever once bothering to knock on the actual door. Leah stood at that window along, while after he'd finally gone, heart hammering hard, hands pressed flat against her belly like she could somehow shield what was growing inside her, from something that hadn't even threatened them yet directly. Not with actual words, anyway. But she'd learned enough by now about men, and their quiet, careful calculations to know precisely what she'd just watched unfold. A man measuring something he fully intended to take for himself, one way or another. When Caleb came in, from the trap lines, that evening, she told him everything in detail. Every single piece, the coat, the small leather book, the way the man's gloved hand had moved slow, over that rock like he already believed he owned it outright. Caleb's face went hard in a way she hadn't seen settle over him since the day Josiah first rode up half-frozen, with that news about Elder Bontrager. Blackwood, he said. Just the single word. It was entirely enough on its own. They know, Leah said. About the silver running under our ridge. They know exactly where to dig for it, Caleb said grimly. Which means somebody carrying a map inside their own head walked them straight to the exact spot. He looked off toward the settlement, invisible now beyond the tree line, but present all the same, the way an old wound stays quietly present even long, after the skin closes back over it. Somebody who knew this land well. Knew it intimately enough to draw the whole thing out on paper. The truth finally came 3 full days later, and it arrived the way most bitter truths tend to, sideways, delivered through somebody, who never once meant to become the one delivering it. Sister Ruth arrived entirely on foot, which alone should have told them plainly how serious this particular matter truly was, because no woman her age walked 2 full hours, through snow drifted knee-deep, unless something had already cracked open badly inside her, that she simply couldn't carry alone any longer on her own. Caleb helped her inside, settled her by the fire, pressed hot tea firmly into her shaking hands. She didn't drink a drop of it. Just held the cup, staring hard into the flames like she was searching for whatever courage she needed somewhere down there in the fire itself. I have to say this fast, Sister Ruth said finally, before I lose my nerve about it entirely. Say it, Caleb said. Gentle in tone, but there was clear steel running underneath it. Elder Bontrager owes a debt. The words came rushing out of her all at once, like water finally breaking hard, through a dam, that had held far too long against the pressure. A debt to a land company out of Helena proper. Gambling, some folks whisper. Others say bad cattle investments, that never once paid off as promised. I don't rightly know the particulars myself. I only know for certain he's owed money now for 2 full years running, and men have come, through the settlement twice already asking pointed questions after him. Leah's stomach dropped clean, through the floorboards beneath her. And, Sister Ruth continued, forcing herself doggedly onward, 3 weeks back now, a man came, through claiming to represent some mining concern or another. Spoke privately with Amos for well over an hour straight. Her hands tightened hard around the still untouched cup in her lap. I saw money change hands between them, Leah. Right through the meeting house window myself. I told myself at the time it was nothing at all. Simple church business. But then Josiah came back talking about that very same company asking pointed questions, after your husband's land specifically, and I found I could no longer tell myself that particular lie. The fire popped once, sharp. Nobody spoke for a long, heavy moment afterward. He sold us out. Leah said it finally, quiet, flat, the words feeling strange, and impossibly heavy in her own mouth, as she spoke them aloud. Elder Bontrager sold this land clean out, from under us, just to settle his own private debts. I believe so. Sister Ruth whispered it. God forgive me for saying it plain, but I believe so entirely. Caleb had gone very still throughout all of this. The particular kind of still, that Leah had learned, across these short months of marriage, meant something genuinely dangerous was building steadily underneath the calm surface. Slow and patient, as a coming storm gathering strength offshore. That's why he pushed so hard. Leah said it slowly, understanding arriving now in careful pieces, each one clicking firmly, into place like a key finally turning inside a lock she hadn't fully known existed, until this moment. At the trial itself. He wasn't only ever trying to be rid of me specifically. He needed me gone entirely, from the settlement, so nobody would think to ask why a mountain man kept showing up regular to trade there so often. Needed the whole path cleared, so he could deal quietly, with Caleb's land, without anybody watching close enough to properly notice what he was doing. I can't say for certain, not entirely. Sister Ruth said. I only know what I personally saw, with my own 2 eyes. And I couldn't let you sit up here another single day not knowing the truth of it. She left an hour later, refusing outright to stay the night despite the bitter cold, saying firmly she needed to be back, before anyone down below noticed how long she'd truly been gone, from the settlement. Caleb walked her partway down the trail himself, rifle slung over one shoulder, and when he finally came back his face had settled, into something Leah hadn't seen resting on him before now. Not quite anger exactly. Something colder than that. Something that had already begun quietly calculating precisely what needed to come next. They'll come for the land eventually, he said, staring hard into the fire. Once they've mapped that vein out proper for themselves. Men like that don't typically ask twice for anything. They simply take what they've decided they want. And if we refuse to sell, Leah said. Caleb looked at her then, and there was something sitting in his eyes, that frightened her considerably more than that well-dressed stranger on the ridge ever had. Then they'll find some other way to get us off this land entirely, he said. One way or another, eventually. The storm rolled in on a particular Tuesday, though up on that mountain the days had long since stopped mattering much the way they once had down in the settlement, where church bells still marked every single hour, and every soul knew exactly what day it happened to be purely by old habit alone. Up here, days were simply weather, one following hard, after another, until this particular one arrived different, from every single one that had come before it. It started out like most storms did. Gray sky pressing low and heavy. Wind picking up sharp out of the northwest. Caleb watched the horizon along, while that particular afternoon, jaw set tight, before he finally came inside, and barred the door. Not the way he usually did it, casual, out of pure habit, but deliberate this time. Careful. The exact way a man bars a door, when he genuinely expects something considerably worse than mere snow to come knocking, before the night is through. Something's wrong, Leah said. She'd learned by now to read him well enough to know precisely, when his particular stillness meant peace, and when it meant something closer to its exact opposite. Dogs have been uneasy all day long, Caleb said. Wind's wrong too, somehow. Doesn't smell like only snow coming. Which was the kind of thing a genuine mountain man said, and Leah had learned by now not to question statements like that, because Caleb Ashford's instincts about this particular land had never once proven wrong in all these months. By full nightfall the storm had turned genuinely vicious. Wind screaming down hard off the peaks, snow driving sideways, with enough force to blot the entire tree line out completely. The cabin groaned steadily under the assault, timbers shifting audibly, the fire dancing wild every single time a fresh gust found its way down, through the chimney. And underneath all of it, underneath the wind itself, underneath the groaning timbers, the dogs began to growl low. Not the low warning growl they gave for deer, or elk passing too close, through the trees. This was different entirely. This was the particular growl of animals, that understood, in whatever precise way animals come to understand such things, that men were coming toward the cabin. And not men, who meant them any good at all. Caleb was at the window, before Leah had even fully registered the sound herself. He lifted the curtain, with 2 careful fingers, peering out hard, into a night gone entirely white, and violent all at once. "Lamplight," he said quietly. "Moving steady between the trees out there. In this weather." Leah's voice came out thin, barely audible over the wind. "Men don't typically ride blizzards for pleasure," Caleb said. He crossed to the gun rack, pulled his rifle down, checked it over, with hands that had gone perfectly steady despite everything unfolding around them. "They ride blizzards specifically, because they believe the storm itself gives them cover nobody else would risk following them through." Leah's hand went instinctively to her belly. Not fear exactly, though fear certainly lived there too. Something older than fear alone. Something closer to a mother animal sensing plainly, that the den itself was no longer safe, from what approached. Caleb saw the movement clearly. Crossed the room in 3 long strides, and placed himself firmly between her and the door. "No one gets anywhere near you," he said. "Not tonight. Not ever, so long as I draw breath." The knock, when it finally came, wasn't truly a knock at all. It was a closed fist, hard, 3 sharp times, followed immediately by a voice pitched deliberately to carry clean over the howling wind. "Ashford. Open up in there." Caleb's eyes met Leah's across the room. Something passed silently between them in that instant, not words exactly, something considerably older than words, the kind of deep understanding that only ever exists between 2 people, who have already quietly decided, without ever needing to say it aloud, precisely what they're each willing to die protecting. "Stay behind me," he said. "Whatever happens next, however this goes." He opened the door only enough to face whoever stood waiting beyond it, rifle raised firm, wind tearing straight, into the cabin like it had been patiently waiting all night long for precisely this chance. 3 men stood out on the porch. Heavy coats crusted thick with white. Faces hard with cold, and something considerably worse than cold sitting underneath it. The man standing in front, tall, lean, a pale scar cutting clean through one eyebrow, stepped forward with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who had done this particular kind of work plenty of times before, and fully expected to walk away from it again the exact same way tonight. "Evening, Ashford," he said easily. "Name's Silas Crane. I represent certain interests out of Helena proper." "I know exactly what you represent," Caleb said. Flat. Cold as the storm itself. "Get yourself off my porch." Crane's mouth curled slightly, not quite forming, into a genuine smile. "Company's fully prepared to make you a fair offer for the mineral right sitting under this particular parcel. Real fair, considering everything. Land's not for sale," Caleb said. "Not now. Not ever." "Everything's for sale eventually," Crane said easily. "Question's really only ever what particular price finally does the trick. Not this time." Caleb's voice hadn't risen one bit, through any of this, but something running underneath it had gone hard now, as the frozen ground itself beneath their boots. "Now get yourselves off my land, before this storm becomes the very least of what you 3 have got to worry over tonight." Crane's eyes drifted slowly past Caleb's shoulder, into the cabin itself, where the firelight caught the shape of Leah standing frozen by the hearth, one hand pressed instinctively over the curve of her belly. "That your wife there?" Crane said. Something changed subtly in his voice, as he said it. Something Leah didn't care for at all. "Heard tell she used to run Amish. Heard her own people didn't much want her either, back before you." His eyes came back sharp to Caleb now, deliberate, pointed. "Funny thing about mountain land, nobody's ever officially claimed proper just yet. Man goes missing up here during a storm like tonight, nobody official ever comes looking for him. Nobody ever really does, out this far. The naked threat sat there plainly in the open doorway between them, clear as the wind howling steadily past. Caleb's hand tightened hard on the rifle stock. You threatening me plainly, on my own porch. Just talking weather is all, Crane said, and there was something in exactly how he said it, light, almost pleasant in tone, that made it considerably worse somehow than, if he'd simply shouted the threat outright instead. Storms like this one tonight. A man could easily freeze out here. Wife too, come to think on it. Real shame, that would be. Get off my land. Caleb said it again. Quieter this time around. Which was somehow, impossibly, more frightening than, if he'd shouted the words instead. Crane's hand drifted slow, and deliberate toward the inside of his coat. Leah saw the movement before Caleb fully did. Caleb moved first, fast. Grabbed Crane hard by the front of his coat, and hauled him bodily clean off the porch, into the deep snow below. The other two men went immediately for their weapons, but Caleb was already slamming the door shut hard, throwing the heavy bar across it a half-second, before the first gunshot cracked loud against the solid wood. Get down! Caleb shouted. Leah dropped fast behind the hearth, heart slamming so hard against her ribs she felt it clearly in her throat, in her wrists, in the place low in her belly, where two small lives turned restless at the sudden violence of the noise erupting all around them. Another shot rang out. A window shattered somewhere near the loft stairs, glass and snow exploding violently inward across the floor. They'll break straight in, Leah gasped. Caleb was already loading his revolver, movements fast and precise despite the chaos, despite the wind now screaming freely, through the broken window frame. He pressed the spare rifle firmly, into her shaking hands. You hide behind the hearth, he said. Anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you shoot straight through them. Understand me clearly. I've never. You learned, he said, cutting her off sharp, gripping her shoulder hard enough to steady them both at once. 3 weeks back. You put a whole dead center in a board 40 yards off, clean. You can do exactly this too. Leah's hands shook hard around the rifle stock. But she nodded firmly anyway. Our children need their mother, Caleb said. Fierce. Certain beyond any doubt. Alive. Fighting hard. However tonight happens to go for the both of us. Her heart stopped dead for one full beat. Because he had never once said it quite this plain before. Not sons as some distant prophecy. Not sons as an old promise made, over 3 cold graves. Children, spoken as simple, present, entirely undeniable fact standing right in this room with them. More gunfire cracked outside. Shouting, half swallowed whole by the screaming wind. Caleb shoved the heavy oak table hard against the broken window, then dragged a second heavy piece of furniture across against the door itself, turning the whole cabin into something considerably closer to a fortress than any home. They won't get anywhere near you, he said, low, fierce, meeting her eyes one final time, before he moved hard toward the door. Not while I'm still breathing air. Caleb. I'm ending this tonight, he said. One way or the other, before this night is through. No. Leah grabbed hard for his coat sleeve, fear finally breaking clean, through everything she'd managed to hold steady, since that very first knock. If you go out there they'll kill you dead. He caught her face firm in both hands, forehead pressed briefly hard against hers, breath ragged, urgent, full of everything neither one of them had time left remaining to properly say out loud. Leah. His voice cracked slightly on her name. I would die 1,000 times, over before I ever let them near you. Before I let them anywhere near our children. Then he was gone, out into the screaming white darkness, rifle raised high, and the door slammed hard shut behind him, with enough force to rattle the entire frame of the cabin around her. Leah crawled fast to the shattered window, snow already drifting thick across the floorboards, heart hammering so violently now, that the babies inside her kicked hard in clear protest. Gunfire cracked sharp, through the storm outside, close, then farther off, then close again, each individual shot landing somewhere deep in her chest like it had been aimed directly at her specifically. Caleb. She forced the name out steady, refusing to let fear scramble it loose. Caleb, come back to me. Please, I'm begging you. The storm gave absolutely no answer back. She pressed herself lower behind the overturned table, rifle gripped so tight now her knuckles had gone entirely white, listening hard to muffled shouting outside, to boots crunching fast, through deep snow, to sound she couldn't properly place, and had no desire whatsoever to place. Then, silence. Not peaceful silence at all. Not the good kind. The particular kind, that only ever arrives, after something genuinely terrible has already finished happening somewhere close by, and simply hasn't announced itself to you yet directly. Caleb. Her voice cracked hard on his name, barely audible now, over the wind still clawing steadily at the broken window frame. Caleb, answer me. Please answer me. Nothing came back. Only wind. Only snow, hissing sideways through the shattered glass, settling cold across the exact spot on the floor, where her husband had stood not 5 full minutes before, promising her plainly he'd come back to her. Leah pressed a trembling hand flat against her own belly, feeling the frantic movement clear beneath her palm, 2 small hearts beating fast, and afraid right alongside her own racing pulse. Please, she whispered again, to the storm itself, to the darkness pressing in all around, to whatever god still bothered listening at all to a woman, who had already been thrown away twice now by people, who were supposed to protect her properly. Please don't take him from me too. Somewhere out in, that churning white violence, muffled hard by wind, and distance both, she heard something, that stopped her own heart cold dead in her chest. A single gunshot rang out. Followed, a long, unbearable moment later, by a man's voice, Silas Crane's voice, she felt nearly certain, carrying thin and satisfied clean over the wind. Get him up on his feet. Boss'll want him breathing proper, when he finally pays out for what this land's truly worth. They had him. Whatever exactly had happened out there in that darkness, however that gunfire had ultimately gone between them, they had Caleb now. Alive, apparently, for the moment at least. Which meant plainly this wasn't over yet. Which meant Leah Ashford, 28 years old, cast off once already by one family, chosen freely by another, carrying 2 children, who had arrived considerably faster than any midwife could rightly explain, was going to have to decide, in the next several critical minutes, exactly what kind of woman she truly intended to become tonight. The dogs whined low against the barred door. The wind screamed on outside, indifferent, endless, entirely unbothered by any of it. And somewhere out there in all, that white and dark, her husband was still breathing. For now, at least. She just had to make certain it stayed that way through the rest of this long, terrible night. Silence has a genuine weight to it. Leah had never once known that clearly before tonight. Never known that quiet itself could sit down heavy on a person's chest like a stone, pressing hard, daring them to breathe wrong even once. She stayed crouched behind the overturned table a long while. Counting her own heartbeat steadily, because she didn't fully trust herself to count anything else safely right now. Because if she let herself start truly thinking about what that single gunshot had actually meant. If she let that particular thought follow itself all the way down to the very bottom, she wouldn't manage to get back up again tonight at all. So she simply didn't allow it. She made herself stand instead, forcing her own legs to hold. The cabin looked like a genuine battlefield now. Glass scattered thin, and glittering clean across the floorboards. Snow drifted steadily in, through the broken window, already forming a small white dune hard against the leg of the overturned table. The fire had burned down low to embers, throwing more shadow now than actual light, and somewhere in that deep shadow Leah found herself staring hard at the cradle Caleb had carved with his own 2 hands. Still sitting quiet by the hearth. Untouched. Patiently waiting. Not tonight, she thought fiercely. You don't get to sit empty tonight of all nights. She checked the rifle first, hands moving steady now despite everything. Then the revolver Caleb had left behind him in his haste, the one she barely knew properly how to load, but forced herself to load anyway, fingers clumsy in the cold, in the fear, in the strange new steadiness that had started climbing up slowly through her chest to replace the fear one full breath at a time. Because here was the one thing nobody back in that entire settlement had ever truly understood about her. Not the bishop. Not Elder Bontrager. Not one single soul who had ever looked hard at her broad shoulders and called them plainly a burden to be managed. She had spent 28 full years being told her body was simply too much, straight through. Too big for the pews. Too big for any wedding line. Too big, too much, too heavy for any man to properly want beside him. Except too much was precisely what this particular night now required of her. She pulled on her heavy cloak. Wrapped a second shawl over the top of it, the thick wool one Sister Ruth had once given her, back before any of this had even begun, back when a simple apology was the only real gift anyone had thought to offer her. She laced her boots tight. Tighter still. Tight enough to survive whatever ground she was about to cross out there in the dark. The dogs whined at the barred door, confused, restless with worry. Stay, she told them firmly. Then, because some part of her needed to hear the words spoken aloud, needed to hear her own voice commit fully to the thing she was about to attempt, I'm going out to bring him home. She stepped out into the full storm. The wind hit her like a solid wall the instant she cleared the door. Like something genuinely solid enough to lean hard against, except it pushed instead of holding steady, shoving her sideways, with a force that nearly folded her straight at the knees. Which was fine, in the end. She'd been folded before in her life. She knew precisely how to straighten back up again. She followed the tracks Crane's men had left behind them, half erased already by the drifting snow, but not gone entirely just yet. Boot prints heading steady north, toward the ridge. Toward the very silver seam that had started this whole terrible chain of events in the first place. Her mind kept trying hard to run ahead of her steady feet, kept trying to imagine the very worst of what she might find waiting at the end of this particular trail. She yanked those thoughts back firmly, every single time they surfaced. Because panic doesn't track a man successfully, through a blizzard. Panic simply gets you both killed out here. Her father used to say something similar about wolves circling close around the sheep pens back home. Said plainly that the animal who survives such a night isn't ever the one that panics first and runs blind. It's the one that thinks clearest of all, when every part of its body is screaming loud to do the exact opposite thing. She thought clearest now, or at least she tried her best to. The land out here she didn't know intimately, not the way she knew the fields back in the old settlement, but she did know land in general, its patterns, its logic. Knew how snow drifted hard against a slope depending on precisely which way the wind cut through it. Knew that men moving fast, through unfamiliar country tended naturally to follow the path of least resistance available to them, rather than the smartest available path, because raw fear makes fools even out of otherwise careful men. Which meant Crane's crew would most likely have taken the low draw running between the ridge and the tree line. Easier walking for them, certainly. Considerably worse tactical position, though, if it ever came down to that. Leah adjusted her course accordingly, and kept moving steady, through the deep snow. She found the first sign of them nearly a full hour later. A trampled clearing, blood dark against the pure white snow, already half-buried now beneath fresh fall. Her stomach clenched hard enough to double her clean over for a long moment, one hand braced hard against a pine trunk, breath coming out ragged and fast. Not Caleb's blood, she told herself firmly. Couldn't possibly be his. Wouldn't allow herself to believe it was. She forced herself back upright, and kept moving forward, following the drag marks now clearly visible beside the boot prints, the unmistakable furrow left by a man being hauled bodily rather than walking freely under his own power. They were taking him somewhere specific. Which meant, plainly, he was still alive enough to need the taking in the first place. She held on to that single thought like a rope strung tight, over a genuine cliff edge. The old line shack sat half-collapsed against the base of the ridge, a trapper's shelter Caleb had mentioned once only in passing conversation, abandoned longer now than either of them had even been alive up on this mountain. Firelight flickered weak and orange through a gap in the boarded-up window. Voices carried on the wind toward her. 3 of them, she counted carefully. Maybe 4 in total. Leah crouched low behind a fallen log some 50 yards out from the shack, rifle balanced across her knees, and forced herself to think clearly instead of simply feeling everything at once. Because charging straight in, the one thing every single part of her body was screaming loud at her to do right now, would get Caleb killed dead, before she ever even crossed half that open clearing. 3 armed men waiting inside. 1 heavily pregnant woman armed, with 2 rifles she'd only been practicing with for a scant few weeks total. That particular math simply didn't work out favorably. Not straight on, head first. So she thought hard about the land instead. About what she actually, genuinely knew how to do well. She'd spent her entire whole life managing livestock far too large, and far too stubborn to ever be moved along by brute force alone. You didn't wrestle a half-ton bull straight into a pen, through pure strength. You built a proper chute instead. You used the animal's own natural instincts cleverly against itself, funneled its raw fear carefully in the exact direction you actually needed it to go. Men weren't really all that different from bulls, in the end, when it truly came down to it. Not when they were sufficiently frightened, or bitterly cold, or simply desperate enough to get themselves somewhere warm again quickly. She studied the shack a long careful moment. 1 single door. 1 window with a gap wide enough to see firelight through clearly, but not wide enough to shoot through cleanly from any real distance. A woodpile stacked hard against the north wall, half-collapsed already, exactly the kind of obstacle a careless man might easily trip over in the pitch dark, if he suddenly had good reason to move fast. An idea began slowly forming in her mind. Rough around the edges. Genuinely dangerous to attempt. The exact kind of plan her father would have called reckless outright, and her mother would have called precisely the sort of thing Leah always did anyway, ever since she'd been a stubborn girl too big and too willful to stay contained inside any fence built specifically for someone smaller than her. She began to move carefully through the snow. First, the horses. 3 of them stood tethered loose to a fallen branch near the tree line, blanketed heavy against the bitter cold, but otherwise left entirely unguarded, because Crane's men had assumed, correctly enough until this exact night, that nobody in their right mind would ever be out chasing them, through a full blizzard. Leah crept close, slow and careful, every muscle in her body screaming hard against the cold, and worked the tether knots free one by one, with numb fingers. Her hands had gone half-numb by now, clumsy with cold, and twice she very nearly gave up entirely on the task. Twice she forced herself to keep going anyway, refusing to quit. The horses shifted uneasily, but didn't bolt just yet. Not until she truly needed them to. Second, the woodpile itself. She found a length of rawhide cord tucked deep in her coat pocket, old habit, the exact kind of thing a farm woman always carried, without ever really thinking twice about why, and strung it low across the doorway, right at ankle height, tied off firm to the collapsed edge of the woodpile stack. A crude trick, honestly. The exact kind of thing a girl learned setting simple snares for rabbits, never intended for grown men. Except men, caught out in the pitch dark, moving in a genuine hurry, weren't really all that different from rabbits, when their own feet suddenly found something unexpected waiting underneath them. Third, the noise itself. This was the part that frightened her most of all, because it required getting close enough to potentially be seen clearly. Close enough that, if this entire plan went badly wrong, there would be no second chance remaining to fix it. She circled wide around the back of the shack, until she stood near enough to the horses once again, rifle slung across her back now, revolver held ready in hand. She took one steady breath. Calmed it the exact way Caleb had carefully taught her, out slow, out until her lungs had gone fully empty, and her hands had finally gone quiet and still. Then she fired a single shot straight up, into the air. The night exploded outward with sound. The horses screamed in fright, and bolted hard, crashing away fast, through the trees, tack jingling wild in the darkness. Inside the shack, voices rose sharp, and sudden with alarm. What in hell was that? Go check the horses. The door slammed open hard. A man came stumbling out fast, rifle raised high, eyes wild and the firelight spilling out behind him from inside. And his boot caught the rawhide line square across the ankle. He went down hard, into the collapsed woodpile, logs scattering loud in every direction, his rifle firing wild off, into the dark, as he fell. A second man came out right behind him, tripped hard over the first man's sprawled body, and the two of them went down together in a tangled heap of curses, and wet snow. Leah didn't wait around to see the rest of it play out. She was already moving fast, circling quick around the back of the shack, while the confusion still held strong, praying, actually praying now, words she hadn't spoken, with any real sincerity, since she was a small girl kneeling close beside her own mother, that the third man remaining inside was Silas Crane himself, and that Caleb was still breathing, when she finally found him. She found the back wall of the shack. A gap between two old boards, wide enough to see clearly through. Caleb sat bound tight to a support post in the center of the room, head hung low, a dark stain matting hard, through the hair above his temple. Alive. She could see his chest rising, and falling, slow but steady, and something deep in her own chest very nearly buckled entirely, with pure relief, before she forced it firmly back down inside her. Not yet. Not safe just yet. Silas Crane stood, over him, revolver drawn and steady, shouting something sharp toward the door, where his two remaining men were still scrambling hard to get back up out of the snow outside. "It's a woman out there," one of them was shouting back, clear disbelief thick in his voice. "Just some woman, alone out there." "Then shoot the damn woman," Crane snapped hard. Leah's blood went cold, and hot both at once, all through her body. She moved fast to the gap in the boards, raised the rifle steady, and did the one thing left remaining to do. "Crane." Her own voice, steady and clear, carrying clean through the broken wall, surprised her almost, as much as it seemed to genuinely surprise him in that moment. Silence fell inside the shack. Then Crane's voice came back, low, careful now. "That the wife out there?" "Let him go free," Leah said. "Or I put a bullet clean, through this wall right now, and take my chances on wherever exactly it happens to land." A pause stretched out. Then, unmistakably, a short laugh, thin, entirely humorless. "Big talk for a woman standing alone out in a blizzard." "I'm not alone out here." Leah said it firm. And in that exact moment, one hand pressed briefly against her own belly beneath the heavy shawl, she meant those words in every single possible way a woman could ever mean such a thing. "I've got everything I was ever told plainly I couldn't carry. And I carried every bit of it anyway, straight through. So don't you dare mistake me for something small tonight, Mr. Crane. I promise you plainly, that would prove to be the very last mistake you ever make in this life." Another silence followed. Longer this time around. Then, from somewhere inside, Caleb's voice came, rough, weak, but entirely unmistakably alive. "Leah." A pause, like the single word cost him something real to say. "Get yourself out of here. Now, while you still can." "Not without you," she said back firm. Not ever without you, not for anything in this world. Crane's remaining men had gathered back at the doorway now, rifles raised uncertain toward the darkness outside, unsure exactly where to properly aim them. Which was precisely the moment Leah needed most. Because uncertainty itself, she'd learned plainly tonight, was its own particular kind of weapon in the right hands. She fired once more, not directly at the men this time, but at the lantern hanging just inside the doorway, close enough to catch it clean and true. Glass shattered loud. Burning oil sprayed hard across the floorboards near the entrance, and flame caught fast against the dry, ancient wood of the old shack. Chaos erupted instantly. Crane's men scrambled back hard, from the sudden spreading fire, shouting in alarm, and in that brief half-second of pure confusion, Leah was already moving fast around toward the door itself, revolver raised and steady. "Cut him loose," she said, stepping forward through the rising smoke, rifle trained square on Silas Crane directly. "Right now. Or I promise you plainly, you burn in this shack the exact same, as the wood around you." Crane's eyes flicked fast between her, the rapidly spreading flame, and his two remaining men, who had clearly already decided, in that instant, that this particular job simply wasn't worth whatever they were being paid to finish it. "This isn't over," Crane said, already backing hard toward the door. "It is tonight," Leah said back, steady and final. He ran. His two men ran hard right alongside him, out into the storm, and the deep darkness beyond, and Leah didn't chase after them at all. Couldn't have, even if she'd wanted to. Her hands were already shaking too hard now, the adrenaline draining fast out of her all at once, leaving something closer to pure exhaustion settling in behind it. She crossed fast to Caleb, working the tight ropes loose, with fingers that had gone numb once again, this time from something else entirely besides the cold. "You came for me." He murmured it, voice thick with pain, and something close to genuine disbelief. "Straight into a blizzard. All alone." "Don't," she said, working the final knot free at last. "Don't you dare tell me now, that I shouldn't have come." Wasn't going to say that at all. He managed something close to a real smile, blood dried dark along his temple. "Was going to say plainly, that you're the bravest soul I've ever known in my whole life. Present company included in that count." She helped him up carefully, his full weight heavy against her shoulder, and together the two of them stumbled out of the burning shack, into the deep snow outside, the flames behind them already climbing high enough now to light the entire clearing bright orange against the falling white all around. Leah looked back once at the fire steadily consuming the very place, where three men had planned coldly to trade her husband's life away for a company's simple profit margin. Let it burn, she thought fiercely. Let it burn straight down to absolutely nothing at all. They hadn't gotten 50 full yards, before a second sound reached them clear, through the storm. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders, coming on fast up the trail, from the settlement side, cutting hard through the storm, with a clear purpose, that made Leah's stomach clench tight all over again. Because she was fully out of tricks now. Out of rawhide cord, and lantern oil, and whatever last reserve of raw nerve had carried her successfully this far tonight. Whatever exactly was coming hard up, that trail toward them, she had nothing left remaining to meet it with, except her own body placed firmly between it and Caleb. She positioned herself in front of him anyway, revolver raised steady, and waited there in the driving snow. The first rider broke fast, through the tree line, and Leah's finger tightened hard on the trigger, before her eyes had even fully registered the shape of him clearly. A badge, catching what little available light there was. A long coat, official looking in a way none of Crane's men had ever worn. "Hold your fire," the man shouted loud, both hands raised high, reins looped loose around one wrist. Marshal Cole Whitfield, out of Helena proper. "I'm not here to harm anybody tonight." Behind him, 3 more riders emerged fast, from the trees. And behind them, riding a mule pushed nearly to its absolute limit, Josiah, face frozen bright red, from the cold, but grinning wide, through sheer exhaustion, like he'd just run the race of his entire young life, and won it clean. "Leah," he called out loud. "We came just as fast as we possibly could." Leah lowered the revolver slow, her whole body suddenly trembling hard, with something that wasn't fear any longer. Relief maybe, or perhaps the particular kind of full collapse, that only comes after holding yourself together far longer than any body should reasonably ever be asked to manage. Josiah. She managed it. What exactly is all this? Sister Ruth sent me out, he said, swinging down fast off the exhausted mule, hurrying toward them both, through the deep snow. 4 full days back now. Right after she first came up to warn you both about Elder Bontrager. She said plainly that somebody needed to fetch the proper law, official and binding, before things went the exact way she was rightly afraid they might. He glanced toward the burning shack still visible in the distance, then toward Caleb slumped hard against Leah's shoulder, and swallowed hard. Looks like she wasn't wrong to be afraid, in the end. Marshal Whitfield dismounted fast, crossed straight to Caleb, and looked him over careful with the practiced eye of a man who had seen plenty enough injuries in his long time wearing that particular badge. "You Ashford." "That's right." Caleb's voice came out weak, but steady enough. "Got a formal complaint filed against Blackwood Mining, out of Helena proper." Multiple complaints, actually, once word finally started spreading wide. The marshal's jaw tightened hard. Company's been running this exact same play up and down the whole territory for some time now. Find a man's silver first. Find some debt sitting close by, that can be properly leaned on hard. Then let somebody local do the dirty work themselves of clearing the land, while nobody officials watching close enough to properly protect it. "Elder Bontrager," Leah said. The marshal nodded grim. "Man's been sitting in my office down in Helena twice already this month alone. Wants to sell information outright. Once more, just recently, trying to sell that exact same information a second time over, to an entirely different buyer, once he realized the first payment wasn't going to clear properly." He shook his head slow. "Greed makes fools genuinely careless, ma'am. Your young friend there," he nodded toward Josiah, "showed up plain at my office door 4 full days back now, carrying enough solid detail to get me moving fast, and enough good sense besides to keep the whole thing quiet, until we had proof solid enough to properly act on." Leah looked over at Josiah, this same boy, who had once teased her cruel, as a small child, and now stood there soaked clean, through with cold and exhaustion both, having ridden 2 full hard days, through steadily worsening weather, simply because one frightened old woman had asked him plainly to. "Thank you," she said. Simple. It didn't feel like nearly enough somehow. It was all she had breath left remaining to properly give him. Josiah just nodded back, too tired and too young himself to rightly know what to do, with gratitude sitting that heavy on him. They rode back together to the cabin, the marshal's men fanning out wide to search the trail for any remaining sign of Crane and his fleeing crew, though Leah suspected, correctly as it would later turn out, that men built like that ran fast and far the moment a fire and a federal badge both showed up together in the very same night. Caleb rode slumped hard against Leah in the wagon the marshal's deputies had found abandoned near the burning shack, his head resting heavy against her shoulder, blood dried dark now, but no longer actively flowing. He would live. The doctor riding along, with Whitfield's party confirmed, as much within the hour, once they'd gotten him properly back to the cabin, and cleaned the wound out right. Concussion, the doctor said plainly. Nothing worse than that, thank God above. Man's got a genuinely hard head, in more ways than just the one. Caleb managed a weak laugh at that, wincing hard immediately after. Been told that before, more than once. Leah sat beside the bed long, after the doctor had finally gone, long after Marshal Whitfield and his men had made camp outside to wait out the last of the storm, before continuing on down toward the settlement come proper morning. She held Caleb's hand tight in both of hers, watching the steady rise, and fall of his chest like she needed to keep counting it carefully just to fully believe it was real. "You shouldn't have come after me," Caleb murmured, eyes still closed, voice rough with pure exhaustion. "Too dangerous entirely. Too much risk. For you. For them both." His hand moved slow to rest gentle against her belly. "I've spent my whole entire life being told exactly what was too much for me to handle," Leah said quietly. "Too much food. Too much size. Too much woman altogether for any man to properly want beside him." She pressed his hand flatter against the curve, where two small lives still turned restless, even now. "I decided a long while back I was finally done letting other people tell me the proper size of what I could carry on my own." Caleb's eyes opened slow, found hers steady in the low firelight. "I love you," he said. Plain. Unadorned by anything extra. The exact kind of thing that costs a man everything real to say, and nothing at all once he's finally managed to say it out loud. Not because of any old promise made over a grave 15 long years back. Because of exactly who you are, right now, tonight, standing here in front of me. Leah felt something break loose entirely in her chest at that, not grief this time, not fear either. Something warmer altogether. Something that had been waiting a long, long while now for permission to finally arrive properly. "I love you too," she whispered back. "Caleb Ashford. Every single impossible inch of this whole life you've given me since." Outside, the storm finally began to quiet down at last. As though the mountain itself had simply been waiting patiently to hear those exact words spoken, before it would allow the long night to properly end. Morning came clear, and hard-edged at last, the particular kind of blue sky cold, that follows hard, after a bad storm, like an apology nature never quite manages to say properly out loud. Marshal Whitfield rode down toward the settlement at first light, Josiah riding along beside him, and Leah watched them go, from the cabin window, with her heart caught somewhere uneasy between hope and real dread. Because whatever happened down there today would decide considerably more than just Elder Bontrager's own personal fate. It would decide plainly whether the community, that had cast her out some 8 full weeks back would ever truly be forced to look plain at exactly what they'd done to her. She didn't go down herself. Caleb was in no fit state to travel yet, and she wasn't about to leave his side for anything short of the entire world ending outright. But Sister Ruth sent word 2 full days later, carried back up the mountain by Josiah once again, his mule looking considerably less exhausted this particular trip around. The letter itself was short. Sister Ruth had never once been a woman for excess words, when plain ones would do the job just fine. Elder Bontrager confessed everything, once Marshal Whitfield laid the full evidence out plain, before the entire assembled council. Debts owed to a cattle speculation gone badly wrong, 2 full years running now, and a company man, from Blackwood Mining, who had found him desperate enough to sell outright what wasn't rightfully his to sell in the first place. He'd been paid twice, over in total, once for the precise location of the silver vein itself, and once more, later, when he tried selling that exact same information a second time, to a rival buyer, once the first payment had proven insufficient to properly cover what he still owed. The council stripped him of his position, that same afternoon, without much further debate. Some among them wanted him shunned entirely outright. Others argued instead for mercy, for some genuine chance at real repentance down the line. Sister Ruth's letter didn't say plainly which particular side had ultimately won that internal argument, only that the whole matter had been taken clean out of the community's hands the moment Marshal Whitfield announced formal charges would be filed regardless of whatever the church itself ultimately decided among its own members. Blackwood Mining's local agent, the same well-dressed man, who had once studied the ridge behind the cabin, with his gloved hand, and his small leather notebook, was arrested attempting to leave the territory just 3 days later. The company itself, Whitfield's separate letter to Caleb explained, was already facing similar formal complaints, from 4 other parcels scattered clean across the territory, each one following the exact same pattern precisely. Find the debt first. Find the desperate man willing to sell outright what wasn't his to sell. Let the actual law arrive late enough, that possession had already changed hands entirely by the time any one official properly noticed what had happened. Except this particular time, the law had arrived in time. Barely. But genuinely in time, all the same. Deeds fully clear, Whitfield had written in his own steady hand, appended right to the bottom of Sister Ruth's letter. Mineral rights included in full. Companies got no legal claim whatsoever remaining to any of it, and given the considerable mess they've made of themselves up and down this whole territory, I sincerely doubt they'll be troubling either of you again anytime soon. Recommend you register the claim proper down in Helena whenever you're able to travel, just so there's no lingering question about it going forward. Caleb read the letter, through twice, sitting up properly in bed for the first time since the attack, color finally returning steady to his face. "It's finished," he said quietly. Like he didn't fully trust the words yet, even as he spoke them. "It's finished," Leah agreed softly. He looked at her a long moment, something working steady behind his eyes. "You did that," he said. "Not the Marshal. Not Sister Ruth, God bless her stubborn old heart. You did it. You tracked 3 armed men clean, through a blizzard, and burned them straight out of a line shack, with nothing more than a single rifle and a length of plain rawhide cord." Leah felt real heat rise up in her face at that. "I only did what plainly needed doing that night. That's precisely the thing about you, Leah Ashford." Caleb reached for her hand, weak still, but steady all the same. "You've spent your entire whole life being told plainly that you were too much. Turns out too much was exactly what this whole mountain needed most, in the end. Spring finally arrived the way it always does in high country like this. Reluctant at first, snow lingering stubborn in the shadowed places long after the valleys below had already gone properly green, and then all at once, overwhelming entirely, as though the whole mountain had simply decided at last to stop holding back any longer. Leah's belly had grown large enough by then, that even simple tasks left her genuinely breathless, and Caleb, fully healed now himself, though he still carried a thin pale scar above his temple, that Leah privately thought made him look even more like the mountain itself somehow, weathered and permanent, had taken to hovering close enough around her, that she'd started teasing him plainly about it. "I split my own wood for 8 full years, before you ever arrived," she told him one particular morning, swatting his hand firmly away from the axe she'd already picked up herself. "I believe I can manage a few more logs just fine, without a man standing over my shoulder like I might shatter clean apart." "Wasn't worried at all about you shattering," Caleb said, though he didn't step back one bit. "Was worried plainly about you deciding to go fight off another blizzard single-handed, before breakfast again. A man likes to know exactly where his wife's temper happens to be pointed at any given moment." "My temper," Leah said, "is pointed exactly where it needs to be right now. Which today happens to be squarely at this firewood." He laughed then, really laughed, the exact kind of sound that still managed to surprise her every single time she pulled it out of him, and took the axe firmly from her hands anyway, splitting the log himself, while she stood there pretending hard to be annoyed, and failing entirely to hide her own smile. It was 3 days later, in the deep hush just before dawn, that the pains finally began. Leah woke to a tightness low across her belly, that didn't ease off the way it usually did whenever she shifted position in bed. She lay still a long moment, breath held tight, waiting. It came again. Sharper this time around. "Caleb." Her voice came out steadier than she actually felt inside. "Caleb, wake up now." He was upright, before his eyes had even fully opened, some deep instinct in him recognizing the particular tone in her voice, before his sleepy mind had properly caught up with the words themselves. "What is it?" "I think," she said, then stopped hard, breath catching sharp, as another wave rolled clean through her, "I think it's finally time." What followed after that was a genuine blur of motion Leah would only ever half remember clearly afterward. Caleb pulling on his boots fast, shouting loud for the hired hand who'd come up, from the settlement, that spring to help out, with the horses, sending the boy racing hard down the mountain on their fastest mount to fetch the midwife, who had settled, into Larkspur Hollow the previous autumn. Hours passed slow. The pains came closer together, harder each time, until the whole entire world narrowed down to nothing at all, but the rhythm of them, the fire crackling low steady in the hearth, Caleb's hand gripped, so tight in hers she genuinely thought she might break something in his fingers, and found plainly she didn't much care either way. "You're doing this," he murmured against her temple, again and again, through every single wave that hit her. "You're doing exactly this, right now." The midwife arrived just past noon, breathless from the hard ride up, and took over fast, with brisk, practiced hands that steadied something deep in Leah's chest even, through the very worst of the pain. "Won't be long now at all," the midwife said. "This babe's in a genuine hurry to meet the world, by the feel of things." "Babe." Singular, she'd said. Except everyone in that room, everyone across this whole mountain really, had spent months now believing firmly there would be considerably more than just the one. The first cry came just before evening fell, thin and entirely furious, and the midwife lifted a small, red-faced, squalling bundle up, into the golden light spilling, through the window. "A boy," she announced proud. "Strong lungs on this particular one already." Caleb made a sound then, that Leah had never once heard him make before, something caught between a laugh and a genuine sob, raw and entirely unguarded, and pressed his forehead briefly hard to hers, before the midwife was already moving again fast, her attention sharpening once more. "Not finished yet," she said firm. "Another one's coming right behind." Leah found strength inside herself she didn't know still existed anywhere in her, some final reserve buried deep beneath months of exhaustion, and terror and hope all mixed together, and pushed hard, through one more wave. The second cry came, within just a few minutes. Smaller. Sharper still. "Another boy," the midwife said, genuine wonder plain in her voice now. "Sweet Lord above, there truly are more of them coming. 2 sons. Exactly as promised, 15 long years ago now, over 3 cold graves, that had waited a full decade and a half to finally be properly answered. Leah lay back spent, tears streaking silent down her temples, and looked over at Caleb's face, undone completely, radiant, somehow older and younger both at once, and thought, foolishly perhaps, that surely this must be the whole entire miracle now complete. Surely 2 sons was fully enough. Surely the old promise had been kept in complete full. Except the midwife's hands had gone suddenly still again beside the bed. Her head tilted slight, listening hard to something only she could apparently hear just yet. "Well now," she said slow. "Seems this particular family isn't quite finished growing, after all tonight." Leah's eyes went wide with shock. "There's another one coming." "There surely is," the midwife said, already moving fast to help. "Steady now, dear. Last one's always proven the stubbornest of the bunch. It took considerably longer this final time." Leah's strength had very nearly given out entirely by then, and twice Caleb had to hold her firmly upright himself, whispering something low, and constant right, into her ear, that she couldn't fully make out clearly, through the roaring building in her own head, but understood anyway, the exact way you understand a heartbeat, without ever really needing to hear the actual words wrapped around it. When the third cry finally came at last, it sounded different, from the first 2 entirely. Higher pitched. Sharper still than either before it. The midwife lifted the small child up, into the light, and her whole face broke open, into something close to genuine astonishment. "A daughter," she said softly. "Lord above us all. A daughter." The room went entirely silent then, except for the crying of 3 separate newborns, tiny and furious, and entirely, gloriously alive all at once. Caleb stared down hard at the small bundle the midwife had placed gentle, into his waiting arms, his whole face working, through something Leah couldn't quite fully read, shock first plainly, and beneath that shock, something that looked almost like a laugh caught halfway between his throat and his chest. 3, he said, wonder running thick through his voice. 3, exactly as I once promised. Except. He looked up at Leah then, and there were genuine tears standing plain now in his eyes, entirely unashamed of them. I promised 3 sons, he said softly. Told Verity, standing right over that grave, that I'd have 3 sons of my own someday. One for each of the 3 graves I couldn't ever fill back then. He looked back down at their new daughter, cradled so small against him, so entirely unexpected in every way. And the Lord above saw fit instead to give me 2 sons, and a daughter. Like he was quietly correcting my own poor arithmetic all along. Reminding me plain, that the promise itself was never really about the exact number at all. Leah, exhausted well beyond words at this point, reached for his hand anyway. What was it about then, truly, she whispered. Caleb looked at her, at the 3 small lives now filling up entirely a cabin, that had once stood empty, and grieving for 15 long, hard years, and something settled deep, into his face, that Leah had genuinely never once seen resting there before. Not quite certainty exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to real peace, finally, fully arrived at last. About not letting this mountain stay empty forever, he said. About choosing plainly to build something again, after everything that had once tried hard to convince me, that building was entirely pointless. He looked down again at their daughter, her tiny fist curled tight around one of his fingers. The number itself was never truly the promise, Leah. You were the promise, all along. This, he gestured slow at the whole small, loud, impossibly full room around them, this right here was. They named the 2 boys Ezra and Amos. Caleb had insisted firmly on the second name, over Leah's own initial hesitation, arguing quietly that reclaiming a name, from a man, who had once betrayed them both, so badly was its own particular kind of victory. A way of making certain the name Amos would come to mean something considerably better inside this family than it had ever come to mean down in the settlement below. The daughter they named Verity. Leah suggested it herself, 3 full days, after the birth, sitting up in bed, with all 3 children arranged careful in a row against the pillows, watching close for Caleb's reaction, when she finally said the name aloud. He'd gone very still at hearing it. You don't have to, he started to say. I want to, Leah said firm. She was the very beginning of this whole promise, Caleb, in her own way. Seems only fitting she'd be part of how it finally came all the way true. Not a replacement for anyone. Not some lingering ghost either. Just a thread, really. Tying the whole entire thing together proper, start to finish. Caleb hadn't managed to speak at all for a long moment after that. Just reached for Leah's hand instead, and held it steady, until the fire burned low, and the children finally slept, and the whole cabin settled slow, into the particular kind of quiet, that only ever comes, after a long, hard fight has genuinely, truly ended at last. Word of everything that had happened up on that mountain traveled back down to the settlement considerably faster than Leah had expected it might, carried mostly by Josiah, who had taken lately to visiting every few weeks or so with fresh news, and increasingly, with a shy sort of fondness for one particular Ashford household, that had nothing whatsoever to do with silver or scandal anymore. The community's reaction split down the middle, the way these things always eventually do. Some among the older elders muttered darkly, that Leah Ashford had brought nothing but real trouble down on Larkspur Hollow, from the very moment she'd first left it behind. Others, considerably more as the weeks passed on, and the full truth of Elder Bontrager's betrayal settled properly into public knowledge, began speaking of her rather differently now. Quietly, cautiously at first, but differently all the same. Bishop Weaver himself made the long journey up the mountain, that following summer, entirely alone, traveling on foot, arriving finally at the cabin door looking considerably older than Leah remembered him being, and a good deal less certain of himself than he had once seemed, standing in harsh judgment over her, some 8 months back now. "I've come up here to apologize properly," he said, standing awkward out on the porch, hat held in both hands. "For my own part in what happened to you. I should have spoken considerably plainer, that particular day in the meeting house. Should have named the cruelty for exactly what it was, instead of dressing the whole thing up neat in scripture." Leah stood there in the open doorway, baby Verity sleeping soft against her shoulder, Ezra and Amos crawling somewhere busy behind her across the cabin floor, and looked hard at this same man, who had once told her plainly, that the Lord would provide, right before closing a door firmly on her entirely. "You're forgiven," she said finally. Simple, and meant. Not because he had fully earned it just yet, necessarily, but because she'd learned something important this past year about the real weight bitterness adds onto a life already carrying more than enough, as it was. Whether that means you're properly welcome back up this mountain regular is a somewhat different question altogether. One I expect the two of us will answer together, over time, as it comes. The bishop nodded, slow, something like genuine relief, and real shame both moving together across his weathered old face. "That's fair," he said, quiet. "More than fair, honestly, given everything." He left an hour later, and Leah watched him go slow. From the porch, 3 children gathered close around her, one settled on her hip, 2 others clinging tight to the fabric of her skirt, and thought quietly about what a strange thing forgiveness truly was, in the end. Not some door thrown wide open all at once. Just a door left slightly unlatched instead. Enough room left there for something entirely new to grow, through the gap, given proper time. Silas Crane was never caught, in the end. Word came through Marshal Whitfield some months later, that a man matching his exact description had been arrested for similar work out in a different territory entirely, running that same old play again against a different unsuspecting family for a different company altogether. Whitfield promised plainly to send word along, if anything more concrete ever surfaced on the matter. Nothing ever did, in the end. Leah found she could live just fine, with that particular truth. Some debts, she'd learned by now, simply outlive the very people who are owed them, and chasing every last one clean to the ground isn't really much of a life at all. It's simply another kind of cage, dressed up different. Blackwood Mining Company folded entirely, within that same year, buried finally under the sheer weight of lawsuits filed by half a dozen separate families scattered across the territory, all of whom had suffered under that exact same scheme that had so nearly cost Leah her own husband. The silver vein beneath the ridge stayed exactly where it had always quietly sat, registered now properly under Caleb Ashford's own name, and later, through careful legal arrangement Leah herself insisted on personally, under both their names together, as one, and eventually, held in careful trust for 3 children, who would grow up never once knowing real hunger, never once knowing the particular cruelty of being told plainly their own existence was simply too much for the world around them to hold. Autumn came round again at last, a full year now, since Leah Zuck had stood trembling in a meeting house, being told plainly her own body was a burden the community could no longer properly carry. She stood instead now on the porch of a cabin she called home fully, in every real sense of that word, watching Caleb chase Ezra and Amos hard across the yard, while Verity slept content against her chest, and thought quietly about how very far a person could genuinely travel in just 12 short months, once they finally stopped believing the smallest possible version of themselves, that other people had once tried so hard to hand them. Sister Ruth visited, that particular week, older now herself, considerably slower on the long walk up the mountain trail, but no less sharp behind her eyes for all that. "You look happy, child," she said, settling slow into the chair by the fire Leah always kept ready for her these days. "I am happy," Leah said back. And meant it fully, in a way she had genuinely never once managed to mean anything, back in the old life she'd left far behind her now. "They still talk about you, you know," Sister Ruth said. "Down in the settlement proper. Not the way they once used to, mind you." A small, satisfied smile crossed her face. Some of the younger women especially ask after you often. About everything that happened up here. Seems your whole story's become something of a lesson to them, whether the elders themselves ever intended it that way or not. What kind of lesson exactly? Leah asked, though she rather suspected already she knew. Sister Ruth's eyes went soft at that. That a woman isn't ever properly measured by how small she can manage to make herself. That the very things a community casts off, as too much sometimes turn out, in the end, to be exactly what saves it, given the proper chance to prove it. Leah looked out, through the window at Caleb, laughing now as Ezra tackled hard at his legs, and Amos tried valiant to climb steady up his back, at the silver ridge glinting faint beyond them both in the low autumn light, hers now, truly and fully hers, earned through fire, and blizzard and a hard truth finally spoken plain between two people, who had each once believed love required hiding away the very parts of themselves the world found too heavy to carry alone. I think, Leah said slow, that's a lesson worth considerably more than any silver this whole mountain's got buried underneath it. Sister Ruth reached over and squeezed her hand warm, and outside the window, the mountain wind picked up steady, carrying the sound of children's laughter down soft, through the pines, out past the ridge, past the old settlement, out into a wider world, that was only just now beginning to understand exactly what it had, so very nearly thrown away for good.